Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us today for our event. We thank you for taking the time to join us for this somber occasion of 365 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our conversation and discussion today will focus on the prospects towards peace in this year, 2023, and how we as civil society and the peace movement can contribute towards creating peace so that this war does not continue for another year. My name is Sean Connor. I am the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau. And so please accept our warm greetings on behalf of IPB and our partners who have organized this event. Without any further ado, I will turn the word over to Rainer Braun, who will introduce our first speaker for the session today.
Thank you, Jean, and hello, and I wish all of you a good day in these difficult times. It's a pleasure and honor for me to introduce our first speaker, Michael von der Schulenburg. He is and was a German diplomat, working 34 years for the United Nations as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He was working for many, many years. And then he was working for the OSCE. He was engaged in peacekeeping and peace-solving missions in Haiti, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Sierra Leone, and with short engagements in Syria, the Balkans, Somalia. So he's really an expert in finding peace solutions, finding ways out of wars. And Michael, it's a great pleasure to introduce you, and I will give immediately the floor to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the word, and thank you. Welcome to everybody who has joined us. Let me just say something introductory remarks, because we talk here about what is actually an extremely sad event. I mean, as we talk, people die, injured, have to play, their livelihoods are destroyed, they have to leave their places and so on. Countries are bombarded and all the rest of it, that we have again a war inside Europe, of course, especially for the Ukrainians, a difficult time, but also that Europe was not able to prevent a new war on its soil, a war that has all the makings of expanding into a wider war even beyond Europe. The point I want to make is this, that I will make a very distant assessment of how I see the war and the chances for peace. Although this is for many people a very emotional event, you have to understand that I'm not giving in to what I think is right or wrong, but as I see these chances, and I do basically something which we often do in the UN when we are asked to engage in a war. The second thing I want to say is that any war is probably the highest form of insecurity in any human activity. It's of course a high physical insecurity for those who live in a war area, and it's an uncertainty that comes with war, and this uncertainty is of course applies also to any assessment one does about the war, and that applies of course also to me. I mean, I also talk here in an area which is actually nebulous and of which we don't know, and I will make their mistakes. It's all assumptions, and I cannot guarantee you that I'm right, and some of you might even have some better ideas. Now, to come to the question you have raised, is that the sad answer to that we can give in the beginning. There is no chance for peace in the foreseeable future. And the reason, I think, which exemplified this one is Mr. Biden's visit to Kiev. He was there to say we continue the war. The decision will be done now on the battlefield. It will not be done by diplomacy. Otherwise, there would be a completely different approach to the whole thing. What we have also to concede that in the United States, the hardliners have won the debate. We know that in the recent months, we had debates among the military and others of how to end the war. This is with the visit of Biden has basically won the hardline that we have to win, and that means that we have to defeat Russia on the Ukrainian soil, and that only weapons will bring the peace. It's language we are used actually before the UN Charter, especially in the World War I, that everybody felt that only weapons can bring peace. The United States will not change its position, I think, for two reasons. The war has always two sides. One side is the war in the media. We can also call it the propaganda war, you know, to try to keep the public opinion on your side and so on. That has nothing to do with truth, it is simply the facts. And we will not, and America thinks that they have won this war. That people see it as an unprovoked war, that an illegal war, that it is a justification for what NATO now does with all the weapons, that they don't talk to the Russians, and so on. And it unfortunately includes also that we don't have any real peace movement in the world, neither in the United States nor in Europe. I mean, there are people like you, but I mean, it's all very, very weak. And we have, of course, a compliant media who is, especially the main media, who is absolutely for continuing the war and providing weapons. Also among the political parties in Europe, we have no major party who is now sort of seeing somehow another way in it. So I think the whole atmosphere a war needs, that there is a public opinion, which is at least not against it, is now in favor of continuing the war. The second aspect for such consideration is, of course, that you think that you can win the war. And I think the United States is with the weaknesses of the Russian army, thinking now that they could support Ukraine to win the war. We should not forget NATO's, Russia's military expenditure over the last decades were at best 5% of what NATO's military expenditure is. That means that NATO has a huge resource on weapons and armaments and whatever, even if they say they don't have enough. But it's 20 times larger than what Russia can mobilize. And they feel that this will sort of make a decision on the battlefield. Also, they think that their armies, especially US armies, is far more modern with their electronic and smart weapons and so on, which are now increasingly applied to the battlefield on the Ukraine. The United States has also the economic power and to back up the war, and we know that the economic fallout, despite all the inflation, has been much less on Western economies, and therefore that the financing of the war could continue. Russia is in a position that it cannot go back anymore. I think Russia has now exposed itself in the war to such a degree that now saying that we are going to withdraw from Ukraine and we leave it all to you would basically mean that Russia would disintegrate. I mean, there is a real threat for Russia that a losing war or giving in like this one to the war, that there would be any stable situation in it. I think we should also, Europe's position on the whole thing is basically to finance and provide military equipment, but I don't think Europe will have any say whatsoever of if this is a continuing war or it will be a peace solution. And I'm afraid, I mean, probably our Ukrainian friends might be very upset what I'm saying now. Also, Ukraine will have ultimately no say whatsoever whether this war continues or ends and how it will end. That will be decided by geopolitical considerations that the United States has. But there is a second aspect to that which is very worrying of Biden's visit. Biden's visit makes very clear that this is now a war between Russia and the United States. I think that we always assumed it, but I think it made it abundantly clear. We have now a situation where virtually all the weapons, all the ammunitions, all the logistics, all the intelligence, and even the salaries of all the soldiers in the Ukraine are paid by NATO countries, by the United States, but also by their European allies. That means we have basically an American army, an American war, with Ukrainian soldiers and an increasing number, as I believe, of foreign soldiers who are contract soldiers or whatever you want to call them, who participate in the war because of the sophistication of the equipment that arrives now. The thing is that we have now, with the visit of Biden, we have now the two presidents facing each other, Biden and Putin, who have in their power to decide the use of nuclear power and nuclear arms, and they could decide over 90% of all the nuclear arms on this world. It's an extremely powerful position in which both presidents are, and the prestige which now Biden put in by going to Kiev means that he will not be able to. He has to think of how to react if the United States or Ukraine, on behalf of the United States, would lose a war, and that becomes particularly difficult if we speak now on both sides of military offensives which are going to start. I mean, these offensives, nobody knows how they're going to work out. America thinks, of course, they can win it. I don't know what the Russians think, but if it goes in one or the other direction, now the prestige on two of the most powerful, at least in the nuclear terms, presidents are online, and their political future. We have therefore a chance, or let's say the risk, that this conventional war is becoming a nuclear war is enormously increasing with this visit. To a certain degree, it is already a nuclear war. There is a situation which we didn't have since we have nuclear weapons in the world. Both NATO, US, and Russia operate under a nuclear umbrella. It would not be possible to conduct this type of war unless each side can rely on their nuclear umbrella. Russia could not have conducted a conventional war against Ukraine if it didn't have, if there wasn't a threat of Russia using nuclear arms. NATO armies cannot intervene directly. If they would, and they could actually by the UN Charter, to go there and to support the Ukraine. Also that there are no attacks on Russian territory is due to nuclear arms. On the other side, US, NATO, all the supply lines, the enormous involvement, because I think by any standard, they are now not only conflict parties, but also war parties, is basically possible because Russia cannot bomb any of the supply lines in Poland or Romania or any of the other things sort of to expand the war. It's simply not possible. And therefore, we have a situation where both sides play with the power of their nuclear armaments. We have seen that there are a number of provocations that sort of could risk that this weak balance sort of falls apart. I like the rocket that hit Poland, like the blockade of Kaliningrad. Now the talk that Russia sent its missile over Romanian territory and so on. There's always very small things, but I think as we don't know where really the nuclear protection line between the two adversaries are, there is an enormous risk that that this could suddenly sort of click and become nuclear. Very worrying in this context is also the assessment Kaplan made, an American scientist of war, where he speaks that Russia's nuclear doctrine is that to escalate nuclear escalation to achieve de-escalation. In other words, if they are in a harsh situation, that they would start exploding 1 or 2 nuclear devices, not necessarily on the battlefield, but they would devise it and in the hope that the other side would sort of come to its senses and say, "Nah, let's better talk before that goes out of hand." If this is possible, and listening sometimes to Biden, I wonder, and it could of course completely go wrong and lead simply to another escalation. Very interesting, I think, is that China suddenly has become internationally active on the war by suggesting peace talks. And I would assess this one, that China sends with this type of thing a warning to the United States that it has an interest in what happens in the Ukraine. For China, a destabilized Russia on its border is a huge threat, especially Russia with 6,000 or so nuclear devices. Also, China does not want to have NATO expansion. We know that NATO has now declared China also a potential enemy. So they will very closely watch that NATO does not come into the Ukraine and sends up bases over there, because they would suddenly have NATO in their backyard. So I think the Chinese peace initiative is a warning, if that doesn't work, that they might choose the other side and would more actively support Russia in maintaining its war in Ukraine, simply for very Chinese national reasons, not necessarily that they think that is a right war in attacking another country or annexing territory. But for China is of course the fear that if Russia loses, the next one are them on Taiwan. So if I can conclude on this whole thing, is that we have a hardline policy. I mean, General Milley, who suggested that this is time to negotiate, has lost this discussion in the United States, and it will be in the end only the United States who decides whether we have war or peace in Ukraine. It will not be decided by any European. We have no politicians in Europe who has a format to say like, that's enough. Europe doesn't have it. We don't have a peace movement who would force Western countries to stop the supply of arms and the continuation of war. And we have always to insist that it's a war continuation by at the same time refusing any negotiations. And that was what makes it so bad. And so the only form that would change it, and none of this all I hope will happen, is that Ukraine might falter first. And the weak point of the American strategy is, of course, that the war has to be conducted by Ukrainians. And it's a question whether or not Ukraine can hold the line, even with modern weapons, whether they have the manpower and the training to engage with modern military equipment like the Leopard 2 and so on. So I think that's basically where we are. We are in a world where that throws us back to the First World War, where we think offenses are going to bring the peace and they're coming closer to the objective we try to reach. Thank you very much. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael von der Schulenburg, for these precise, but not really.
No, it's awful conclusions.
Awful,
no,
you know,
anybody who will attack me is not what I want. I mean, it's simply how I see it.
You know, I'm very happy that you create a realistic picture. Without a realistic picture how it is, we cannot develop strategy how it can become better. And I think we will come back to the discussion about how we can support the way to peace in our last round table. First of all, I'm very happy that we have in the tradition of the IPB peace work, again, the possibility to listen to voices for peace from Ukraine and Russia. I think I'm very happy that I first can announce Yuri Shelyushenko from Ukraine. Yuri, again, it's a pleasure to see you with us, and I will give the floor immediately to you. The floor is to you, Yuri.
Thank you, Rainer. Dear friends, greetings from Kiev, capital of Ukraine. We meet today on a disgusting anniversary of the beginning of full-scale Russian invasion, which brought to my country enormous killing, suffering, and destruction. All these 365 days, I lived in Kiev under Russian bombing, sometimes without electricity, sometimes without water, as many other Ukrainians who were lucky to survive. I heard explosions behind my windows. My home shook from pounding of artillery in distant combat. I was disappointed by failures of Minsk agreements, of peace talks in Belarus and Turkey. I saw how Ukrainian media and public spaces became more obsessed with hatred and militarism, even more obsessed than previous 9 years of armed conflict. When Kiev was bombed, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk was bombed. I called for peace openly, despite threats and insults. I demanded ceasefire and serious peace talks, and especially insisted on the right to refuse to kill. In online spaces, in letters to Ukrainian and Russian officials, calls to civil societies, in nonviolent actions, my friends and colleagues from Ukrainian pacifist movement done the same. Because of closed borders and cruel hunting for draftees at the streets, in transport, in hotels, and even in churches, we Ukrainian pacifists had no choice than to call to peace directly from the battlefield. And it is not exaggeration. One of our members, Andriy Vishnevetsky, was conscripted against his will and sent to frontline. He asks for discharge on the grounds of conscience in vain, because armed forces of Ukraine refused to respect human right to conscientious objection to military service. It is penalized, and we have already prisoners of conscience, such as Vitaly Alexeyenko, who said yesterday before the police placed him to prison for his refusal to kill. He said, I will read New Testament in Ukrainian and I will pray for God's mercy, peace and justice for my country. Vitaly is a very brave man. He so courageously went to suffer for his faith without any attempts to escape or evade prison, because clear conscience gives him a feeling of security. But such sort of believers is rare. Most of people think about security in pragmatic terms, and they are right. To feel secure, your life, health, and wealth must not be in danger, and there must be no worries for family, friends, and whole your habitat. People used to think that national sovereignty with all might of armed forces protects their safety from violent intruders. And today we hear a lot of loud words about sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is key words in rhetorics of Kiev and Moscow, Washington and Beijing, other capitals of Europe, Asia, Africa, America, and Oceania. President Putin wages his war of aggression to protect sovereignty of Russia from NATO on the doorstep, the tool of United States hegemony. President Zelensky asks and receives from NATO countries all sorts of deadly weapons to defeat Russia, which, if not defeated, perceived as a threat for Ukrainian sovereignty. Mainstream media wing of military-industrial complex convince people that the enemy is not negotiable, if not crushed before negotiations. And people believe that sovereignty protects them from war of all against all, in the words of Hobbes. But the world of today is different from the world of Westphalian peace. And feudal notion of sovereignty and territorial integrity don't address brazen human rights violations committed by all sorts of sovereigns, by war, by fake democratic warmongering, and by open tyranny. How many times you heard about sovereignty and how many times you heard about human rights? Where we lost human rights, repeating the mantra about sovereignty and territorial integrity, and where we lost common sense, because the more powerful army you have, the more fear and resentment it causes, turning friends and neutrals into enemies. And no army can avoid battle for a long time. it is eager to shed blood. People must understand that they need non-violent public governance, not belligerent sovereignty. And they need social and environmental harmony, not autarkic territorial integrity with militarized borders, barbed wire, and armed men waging war on migrants. Today, the blood is shedding in Ukraine, but current plans to wage the war for years and years, for decades, may turn whole the planet into battlefield. And if Putin or Biden feel secure sitting on their nuclear stockpiles, I am scared of their security, and millions of sane people scared too. In rapidly polarizing world, the West decided to see security in war profiteering and fueling war machine by arms deliveries, and the East chose to take by force what he sees as its historical territories. Both sides have so-called peace plans to secure all what they want in extremely violent manner, and they make other side to accept new power balance. But it is not a peace plan to defeat enemy. It is not a peace plan to take contested land or remove representatives of other culture from your political life and negotiate on conditions of acceptance of this. Both sides apologize their warmongering behavior, claiming that sovereignty is at stake. But what I must say today, most important thing than sovereignty is at stake today. Our humanity is at stake. Ability of humankind to live in peace and resolve conflicts without violence is at stake. Peace is not eradication of enemy, it is making friends from enemies. It is remembering of universal human brotherhood and sisterhood and universal human rights. And we must admit that governments and rulers of the East and West are corrupted by military-industrial complexes and by great power ambitions. When governments are unable to build peace, it is on us, it is our duty as civil societies, as peace movements. We must advocate ceasefire and peace talks, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere, in all endless wars. We must uphold our right to refuse to kill, because if all people will refuse to kill, there will be no wars. And we must learn and teach practical methods of peaceful life, nonviolent governance, and conflict management. Because even in the field of restorative justice or in mediation instead of court hearings, we see progress of nonviolent approaches to justice. And as Martin Luther King said, we can achieve justice without violence. And we must build ecosystem of peace building in all spheres of life, alternative to toxic militarized economy and politics. This world is sick with endless wars. Let's say this truth. And this world must be healed with love, knowledge, and wisdom by rigorous planning and peace action. Let's heal the world together.
Thank you, Yuri, for these intensive words, I think, which underline the need and the work of the peace movement. And I think we will also come back to this later. It's a great pleasure for me now to announce Karina Radchenko from the initiative 100 Words for Peace from Ukraine. Karina, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see so many familiar faces whom we met, for instance, in Barcelona Peace Forum. At the same time, now the situation is really difficult. We are living on really like a kind of a third world war that we need to stop. And first of all, we need to hear the voices of civilians to promote this agenda. And throughout our project, 100 Words for Peace, we since 2019 started to collect visions of people, what is peace personally for them. And I'm kindly asking Sin now to share one short video from the children of Ukraine. I think it's like the key motivation for us to move forward.
Мир — это вот так, мир — это страна. Мир для мене – це коли немає війни та чисте небо. Мир – это вот так вот, извините, а больше так не буду.
Для мене мир – це підтримка родини та друзів.
Мир – это наша страна, где мы живем, все украинцы.
Для мене мир – це моя родина. Я хочу, щоб вона була завжди жива та вільна зі мною.
Мир – это кто дружба и мир.
Для мене мир – це жити без війни.
Это дружить. Любить маму и папу. Мир – где мы живем. Это. А вот здесь мир. Небо, где мы тогда жили. А так придумали мир. Там мама, папа, там бабушка, там тетя, дедушка, там дядя, кума там. Мир – це для мене як частинка душі.
Це коли немає війни.
Thank you so much for playing it. In fact, many children have lost their parents. Many are now this single moment when we are talking with you. They're hearing the bomb, they're sitting in the bomb shelters, and it means that every single moment missile can destruct houses. On the 24th of February, 1 year ago, we with my family woke up with the hearing of this blast near our house. And since that time, every single moment in my home city, every single day, there are blasts, there are destructed houses. Near 90% of the cities just do not exist anymore. I remember so much hope to these negotiations, as Yuri mentioned. Also, all Ukrainians experience this big hope for negotiations in Turkey, also near Belarus border initially, as well as it was the resolution from Women Political Leaders Movement, of which I am a member, that was signed by the former women presidents of the state, ensuring that and urging to make this call that the leaders of the countries, men leaders, Biden, Putin, Zelensky, everyone will sit in one table. How many lives could be saved? It would have happened in February last year, not now. And now we see clearly this escalation. Not even speaking about these nuclear weapons, Black Mage, these statements that they will use nuclear weapons. There are also threats of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and several cases when missile fell just near 30 meters from the power plant. So it would mean the whole catastrophe for our planet, for humanity. And if we speak about peace talks, they should focus on, first of all, not allowing to escalate and to disseminate this war forward, as clearly a non-participation of Belarus, Sweden, Finland, and further in physical sense, though the war is already happening in Europe. At the same time, not increasing the limits of this war. And the second, the key aspect is ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire, and then proceeding with this kind of peace plan that from China, United Nations to be a part. But the key is to stop right now, because even if we wait until 1 week, several weeks ahead, more people will die. Innocent people, men, women, children who have the fundamental human right to live. We can already hear the tiredness in media, like people try to adjust to understanding that the war is happening. But at the same time, it's very different kind of tiredness in comparison to those who are for 1 year forced to sit in the bomb shelter. So we need to remember there is no tiredness from this war. All your efforts are highly appreciated. Involvement of women is vitally appreciated. And the more women come to the table, the more hope there is. Even United Nations statistics, 30% more of long-lasting peace process within 15 years. It's like the statistics. And I'm ready to sit at any of the table. I am as a girl, I'm not afraid to sit at the table when politicians are afraid, maybe, because when you see the bombs falling down at the neighbor house, nothing can provoke this fear. Negotiations and peace, and also strengthening of the peace movement. Please support peace movement in Ukraine further. Conduct not only speaking, but clear more activism, more action. Support us, and we together, we will be like Shreya Rabindra once has written, we will eradicate this virus of wars everywhere, and we will reach this peaceful globe as humanity. Thank you very much.
Karina, thank you so much for your words. And I can only underline that the peace movement has a key role. And I know that we all who are participants in this webinar are doing at home in very different places the best to promote peace, to fight for ceasefire and negotiations, and we will definitely continue this. And when you were speaking, I had in mind the words of the former Chancellor of Germany, the Nobel Peace Laureate Willy Brandt, who was saying, peace is not everything, but nothing is happening without peace. So thank you so much for your words. And I'd like to give the floor now to my Russian colleague, Oleg Bodrov. Oleg, you're engaged against the war since the first moment. We had many, many discussions how to come to peace again. I'm waiting for your words, and all the best to you in your difficult fight for peace. The floor is to you, Oleg.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to my Ukrainian colleagues and friends. And I'd like to say I'm very agree with all your speeches, and I agree with your position. And we have no any different vision of our future and how it's possible to reach it. And I greeting from the Russian coast of the Baltic Sea. I am 800 kilometers away from Ukraine on the military confrontation line between Russia and NATO. This line runs along the Baltic Sea, 70 kilometers from my house and from the largest nuclear cluster in Europe, near St. Petersburg. There are about 15 civilian and military nuclear reactors and radioactive waste storages here. And this is equivalent of 26 Chernobyl-type reactors. Sometimes ago, an air raid siren sounded here. There were exercises in case of war. It was signal not only for us living in Russia, I'm absolutely sure about this, but also it is signal for all residents of Europe. Incompetent politicians are preparing us for the possibility of military operation in Europe, where about 120 nuclear power units operate and tens of thousands of tons of radioactive waste are stored. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was captured by Russian troops. It was demonstration that there are not any more taboo on the use of nuclear power plants for military purpose. The sabotage of the Nord Stream gas pipeline in the Baltic Sea near Sweden means that military activities has moved out of Ukrainian territory. NATO plans for the victorious military operation at the sea near the St. Petersburg have been published. I believe that the Russian admirals have no less victorious plans in the Baltic Sea. This means that more than 30 nuclear power units in Russia, Finland, Sweden, Germany, Lithuania may be in the war zone. After the armed seizure of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, we can say that we have received a new type of the radiological weapons of mass destruction. In the event of destruction of a nuclear power plant or storage of the spent nuclear fuel with plutonium-239 with half-life of 24,000 years will enter to the environment. The consequences may be more dangerous than the explosion of the nuclear bomb. Ecosystems and giant territories will become uninhabitable for the thousands of future generations. Another radioactive threat is that NATO countries are starting to supply Ukraine with heavy tanks capable of using depleted uranium shells. This can have serious consequences for human health and for the nature. Several regions of Ukraine occupied by Russia were declared like as the subject of the Russian Federation. According to the Russian military doctrine, in the event of the threat to territorial integrity, the Russian Federation may use nuclear weapons. Thus, the new phase of the conflict then has a reason now create prerequisites for escalation for the use of nuclear weapons and escalation into a global nuclear war. It is impossible to stop this negative trend from Russia. The Russian political system is isolated from the society, from the civil society. There is no feedback. Public opponent of the war in Russia are in prison or pay huge fines that to go to support the war. Russian civil society ended up in a concentration camp with around-the-clock war propaganda. Therefore, it is impossible to expect mass protest. At the same time, there are many civil Russian activists who are ready to cooperate against the war with colleagues in Europe and in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of citizens of Ukraine and Russia were killed during the last year. Millions of Ukrainians have left their homeland, fleeing the war. Hundreds of thousands of young Russian people have left the country fearing mobilization. I think today, after the 365 days of catastrophic scenario in Ukraine, the main goal is to stop the death of the people on the territory of Ukraine. And I hope to cooperate to reach this goal with my Ukrainian colleagues and with all my partners from the International Peace Bureau. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleg, and thank you all the three who are parts of the peace movement in Ukraine and in Russia. And I think our greetings and solidarity goes to all our courageous colleagues in both countries, which are fighting against the war, which were partly present at this meeting. And behind them, there are many others who in support of peace is working under very difficult conditions in their countries. Our solidarity is with you, and we hope that we will one day celebrate our common victim, our common success, that we will have peace in Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining the meeting. And I will immediately give over the floor to Kate Hudson, who is the moderator for the next session. Kate, the floor is to you.
Many thanks, Rainer, and thank you to the IPB and supporting organisations. May I just confirm the point that Rainer made, that we really appreciate those very profound and in-depth contributions from the speakers so far, and they absolutely reflect the complexity of the situation that we're facing. We know that there are no easy answers, but certainly they have underscored the urgency, the absolute urgency of reaching an end to this war. And as difficult as it is, we as a peace movement internationally are absolutely committed to doing everything we can to work for a peaceful settlement and to bring an end to this catastrophic war. And so to discuss that in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome a panel of international anti-war activists, people with much experience, being able to share perspectives from different countries. And in order to facilitate the discussion and to help shape the discussion, I'm going to put questions to the panel. They will each have an initial question, and then I'll turn to the other panelists for brief comments on each. But we hope to be able to get through quite a lot of issues to share ideas and to get feedback and understand what it is that we're doing together to work for peace. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our friend Lindsay German. Lindsay is convener of the Stop the War Coalition in the UK, which came into being, into prominence in the struggle against the war on Iraq. Lindsay, could you briefly share with us your thoughts on the factors that have led to this war, and are they problems that can be resolved?
Thanks very much, Kate, and it's very good to be here and to hear the previous speakers, and solidarity to everybody who's campaigning against this war. I think the issue, when we look at why the war took place, obviously the way in which the narrative is told in the Western media is that this started a year ago and there's no kind of prehistory to that. And of course, I think all of us condemn the Russian invasion and the way in which it took place, but I think it's also very, very important that we do look at and do assess the previous period and what led up to it, not just the continuing war which had been going on in Ukraine before that, but also the expansion of NATO in the decades since the end of the Cold War, which has meant NATO expansion right up to the borders of Russia. And in addition to that, since the war began, we've also had further expansion with Sweden and Finland. And you could also argue that Ukraine itself has now become a de facto member of NATO. So I think this has played a very big role in the international conflict. But there are other things I think it's worth just mentioning, which is firstly, the whole 2 decades previously, the war on terror, the Western attacks on Afghanistan, on Iraq, then on Libya, and the war in Syria that we've been seeing. And that has, I think, made the whole situation with conflict and war much, much sharper and much greater than it would have been otherwise. And these have been failed wars in which the British government and the United States government have been absolutely central. There is also the question of the militarization of the world, which we're now seeing also very much increasing in Europe in the last year. But we've seen that in terms of, again, in the last 2 decades, not accidentally, we've seen a doubling of arms spending and military spending throughout the world. And now we have a very, very serious situation. As people have said, there are growing conflicts over this war, both in terms of it escalating itself, but also the differences between the direct war, which I think you have to see now between NATO and Russia, but also the different attitudes to the war that you see in many parts of the world, in China and in the global south, in Brazil, where President Lula is talking about a peace initiative as well. So essentially what has happened is that the war that was supposed to bring peace, the war on terror and its inheritors, has actually become a war which has escalated war itself and the tensions around war. So I think those are the most important things. And just to say, we have now, the British government has been one of the leaders of attempting to prevent any peace talks and of sending weapons to Ukraine. And this is a very, very dangerous development. It's one that we will be, Kate, you and I will be demonstrating tomorrow in London. I know people across the world and in Europe and the United States will be doing the same. So those are my initial thoughts on it.
Thanks very much indeed, Lindsay. And before I invite other brief comments from the panelists, I'm just going to tell you who else is on this second panel. So as well as Lindsay, we're joined by Corazon Valdez-Fabros, who's an IPB co-president. She's from the anti-war movement in the Philippines. Then we have Rainer Braun, who you met earlier, the former director of IPB and long-standing peace activist in Germany. We have Alain Roy from Le Mouvement de la Paix in France. We have Francesco Vignaca from the Italian Peace and Disarmament Network. And we have Medea Benjamin from Code Pink in the United States. So fantastic panel and welcome to you all. Each time I ask a question directly, then we've got the chance for 1 or 2 quick contributions from the other panelists. Would anyone like to come in now to say a quick follow-on from Lindsay's introductory points?
My only comment will be, Lindsay, we are demonstrating tomorrow in Berlin, and it will be the biggest anti-war demonstration since the war starts.
Yes, that's great news, Rainer. And I was very pleased to hear from you yesterday that there was a very big demonstration in Munich recently as well. We know, I'm sure Francesco may mention this later, that I think there's going to be over 100 demonstrations in towns and cities across Italy. We know many in France. So Europe is stirring on the peace front. So that's very good. And I'm sure there will also be protests in the US too. So, well, thanks for setting the scene, Lindsay. Cora, I'm going to turn to you now. There is often a different perspective on the war beyond Europe and North America. So perhaps could you shed some light on this? What accounts for this difference? And what can countries from the global south do to press for a negotiated peace settlement? You're muted. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And good evening, everyone who has joined us today. And and greetings. I would like to answer your question. Let me start by saying that context is very important. In countries beyond Europe and the North America, mostly in the global South, most of us are located in Asia and the Pacific. And many of the countries here are historically frequently faced colonization by the global North countries, especially by Europe and the United States, like in the case of the Philippines. We have unstable democracies, or oftentimes ruled by fascist regimes, family dynasties and warlords and the likes. More often, agrarian-based and not industrialized and highly dependent economically and politically on the global North, which dominates and directs the global South in international trade and global politics. Having said that, our priorities in this part of the world are the basic needs to sustain our lives and our very existence. Jobs to enable us to put food on the table, shelter, education, coping with the impacts of disaster and climate, many others. And the narrowing, especially of the democratic space that denies the protection of civil and economic, social, and political rights under our constitution and under the laws. Unless people in this part of the world and see and understand this very clearly, the impact of the ongoing wars in our lives, now that even NATO troops are coming into this region, even if we are very far away, in terms of distance, as in the case of the war in Ukraine. These forever wars, these proxy wars, we would call it, that are oftentimes waged outside the territory of the military powers that have used our land and waters as places or playgrounds, I would call it, for their war games, military exercises, rest and recreation that has impact on our women and children. It is very difficult to understand it, the connection. We usually deal with, gut issues because it's right there, right in front of us. The continuing bombardment as well of anti-China and pro-US propaganda. You must know who orchestrates all of this information, these lies, and the impunity of the powers that be in violating the rights of the people. But let me answer the second question, responding to that question, I would say we have the responsibility to inform, for people to understand and to make their decision, to be part of the movements as a whole, whether big or small, to expose and oppose definitely these forever wars that we call it, to make our government accountable especially, and to build the broadest and the biggest movement possible that crosses political and social lines and harness the biggest numbers of warm bodies marching in the streets where it matters most. We must not forget how major victories were won, struggle against slavery in the United States and elsewhere, women's emancipation, including the Vietnam War, the People Power Uprising in the Philippines that ended the Marcos dictatorship, which we celebrate this week, the Palau Nuclear Constitution, Chagosian struggle, and many, many more that I could not mention. Social media is not enough. we need the power of the people in calling an end to the Ukraine war and all the rest of wars that are going on in the world today. So let me end there, and let's have a discussion later.
Thanks very much indeed, Fora. And I think that we will all be sharing and explaining our perspectives in terms of mobilizing people. And I like your term of warm bodies. So that's certainly a very strong strand, I think, through all of our work, the need to mobilize, to have mass mobilization against this war. I'm just going to now move to the next question, to Rainer. Rainer, can the concept of common security contribute to a lasting peace? Common security is now on the lips of many, but not everybody. So can this concept contribute to a lasting peace? And can it get traction in a time of escalating military conflict? Over to you.
Common security was a reality in the 80s and 90s and becomes now a vision of a world without war, because this is the main sense of common security. And this vision is also the vision which is never forgotten when we are discussing negotiations and ceasefire, because negotiations and ceasefire should not only stop the war in Ukraine, but we need a new peace architecture in Europe. And this new peace architecture can only be based on the principles of common security. The security interests of one side and the security interests of the other side. Both have to be taken into account and to solve. That is the background. And it is also important because common security, we will only come to these goals with the actions and the activities of the people. And the only chance to stop the war now is to develop, enlarge, and unite the peace movement all over the world. This is the key challenge for all of us. Without the peace movement, the other social movements, the trade unions, the churches will not be more engaged in the fight against this war. So let us do everything to unite the peace movement. Let's have the vision of common security and a world without war in mind. But first of all, we need to stop the war by negotiations and ceasefire.
Thanks very much, Rainer, and you've echoed some of Cora's points there. Would any other panelists like to come in now on either Rainer or Cora's points? Francesco, to you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and for this panel and this webinar in general. I think that what Cora and Rainer said is crucial, because otherwise, if we don't open up the site, we keep talking about one specific war only because now it affects Europe, while there are many wars, many problems, and we can solve each and one of them only taking care of the whole world and with the new strategy that really goes to a common security. So from the beginning, even if we worked a lot on Ukraine, we didn't forget the other wars that are around, and didn't forget the fact that, you know, we have to solve the whole problem. It is not a matter of reaching a peace between Zelensky and Putin. It's a matter of putting everyone on the same table and decide what future we want for the whole planet.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else on this, or I'll move on to Alain? Okay, Alain, welcome. So my question to you, economic factors are very important here. Could you comment on the impact the war is having on ordinary people's cost of living, energy, food, and so on? And is this a factor that can help build popular opposition to the war?
Yes, hi to everybody, and thank you for your question, Kate. My answer does not only concern France, but many countries in Europe and in the world, because the war in Ukraine has made our societies enter a war economy, économie de guerre, as French President Macron says. The first consequence is the increasing prices, in particular the prices of energy, of electricity, following the interruption of Russian gas imports. But also food prices have increased, and the decrease in exports of cereals from Russia and Ukraine has even more terrible consequences in Africa and in the Middle East. The war is seriously affecting trade relations between all countries, and this situation is further aggravated by the policy of economic sanctions decided by the G7, namely the United States and the rich Western countries, including France. The sanctions policy is part of the global economic war against, not only against Russia, but against all countries that refuse to follow the G7 rules. As you know, we are currently living through a very large social movement in France against the pension reform of the government. The government wants to make cuts in pensions, as it had already done in unemployment insurance and in all social and public services. But at the same time, the French president has announced a doubling of the military budget for the next 3 years. And in all NATO and EU countries, we are seeing the same massive increase in military spending. The war in Ukraine is being used as a justification for this escalation of military spending at a time when our health and education systems are in danger of collapse in many countries. In the huge demonstration currently taking place in France against pension reform, there are more and more posters asking for money for pensions and not for war. Nobody believes in a military solution to the conflict in Ukraine, not only a disastrous war for the people of Ukraine and Russia, but also the consequences of this war for the people of other countries must be stopped. We do not want to live in a war economy that only profits arms dealers. We want our countries to make budgetary choices not for death, but for life. This message is also the message of the social movements for a better life. And these social movements are converging with the mobilizations against war and for peace. In 50 towns in France, we will have activities against war in this weekend, and we will find the same message, war, money for life and not for death. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alain. I 100% agree with that approach. In fact, my own organisation, C&D, we currently have a new campaign called Wages Not Weapons, because there are many trade unions, a lot of industrial action for wage rises at this time. Would anyone else like to come in on this element of the discussion? Lindsay.
Yeah, just to add to the points that Kate has made, and thanks, Alain, for talking about the big pensions dispute in France. We have on the demonstration tomorrow, we have a number of speakers from some of the unions that have been on strike and are continuing on strike. And we think it's very, very important to make this connection between the two things, because in every instance, the government claims it does not have the money to pay nurses or ambulance drivers or whoever the latest group is. But there is absolutely no question. The previous two prime ministers, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, both in Parliament this week, argued to send fighter planes to Ukraine. And there is no question ever about finding the money for these things. So I think it's very important to make these links.
Thanks, Lindsay. Medea, over to you.
Yes, just on this issue of pensions, it was interesting that Biden said the other day in talking about all the support the U.S. is giving to Ukraine, he said, and we are paying the pensions of the people. And that kind of sparked a lot of discussion on the social media saying how the U.S. workers are not getting pensions these days, and yet we are paying the pensions of the Ukrainians. So while we don't have a lot of support among the labor unions here in the U.S., I think that kind of thing does get people's attention.
Thanks, Medea. Right, well, that's really interesting. I'm going to turn now to Francesco. As I mentioned earlier, Francesco is from the Italian Network for Peace and Disarmament. Francesco, there's considerable opposition to the war in Italy. We've seen that unfolding. How can building the movement against the war bring pressure on political leaderships to negotiate for peace, and can it, and how?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Of course, we only can have impact on our government, on our politicians, but also on the European level, of course, politicians. And I think that the Italian peace movement was ready to start from the beginning to working on this, because we already had this kind of networks between us that were working on nuclear weapons, on military expenditure, on arms trade, on every aspect, also on the not only the position at single types of war, but in general, asking for a non-violent defense. This is what merged us, and we were able to go beyond our original network. And now the Europe for Peace network is comprised of more than 600 organizations all over Italy. We were able to organize already 2 peace national rally, the second one in November with more than 100,000 people. And this weekend, we expected more than 100 cities, but I think we will go over than 150 cities. Just the day of today, just this Friday, we have 75 cities with events and rallies and every kind of manifestation and events that peace movement can bring you up. And in this thing also the alliance, because we have faith-based movement, we have religious movement, but also trade unions, local organization, and it's quite interesting this kind of alliance. Of course, it's a big tradition of peace movement in Italy. Usually we were not able to organize ourselves so much. So the work we have done in the last few years was important to reach to this point. And this is also shown, and it's my final point, in the polls. Yesterday, there was a poll going out that the majority of Italian people is against the sending of weapons to Ukraine. So only a minority of the Italian public opinion is for the decision of the government. While in the parliament, we see that these kind of things are voted by more than 80% of the politicians. So there's, of course, a problem of transforming the public opinion and the peace movement ideas into the political arena. So it's what we want to do with this kind of organization, manifestation and rallies we have all over Italy. And we are very happy that now we are linked more with our friends of our European and not only European groups. And I think that only bringing together our movement and our request, we can really change things. Just a point. Someone here in Italy says that we are abandoning Ukrainian people because we don't want them to resist. No, we want them to resist in a violent way. We also made a lot of peace action directly in Ukraine for humanitarian purposes. A lot of our groups are inside Ukraine now just to strengthen the help to the population, because we don't want to abandon Ukraine. as long as we don't want to abandon Yemeni people, Syrian people, Palestinian people, and all the people that are inside the conflict. We want to solve these conflicts, and wars and weapons won't solve any conflict and any war. We can only, like Martin Luther King said, we can only fight darkness with light, and the light is nonviolence.
Thanks very much, Francesco. And it's good to hear really of the breadth. That's an incredible breadth you have there of the movement. And of course, just to say, I know we have very strong and good memories of the Italian peace movement going back to the European Social Forum in Florence, which of course was absolutely fundamental in the massive mobilizations against the war in Iraq. So I know we're sending all our solidarity to you for the demonstrations tomorrow. Alain, you want to come in on this? Over to you.
Yes, I was last weekend in Madrid for a peace conference, and it was a good example how to make pressure on governments, because we had two ministers from Podemos, from the Spanish government, and they said after in this conference they will make pressure on the chief of the government not to follow the NATO demands, but to follow the peace plan of President Lula of Brazil or of President of Mexico, and they were very interested by the pressure from the social movements and for these demands. And it's good how to see that these ministers from Podemos and Unidas Podemos, they are inside the Spanish government, and they can benefit the support of the peace movement to make pressure on their own government.
Thanks very much, Alain. That's really very positive. I'm not seeing anyone else indicating now, so I'm going to turn to our last question, which is to Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. It's great to have you with us today, Medea. So my question to you is this: what is the state of public opinion in the US about the war, and what pressure is being brought to bear on the administration to change course on Ukraine? And then a final question as well. What can be done to shift the US away from attempting to assert global domination through military might? I mean, that's the overarching fundamental question, but if you could have a try at those, Medea, we'd be really grateful.
Yes, it's wonderful to be on with you all. And the changing public opinion in the US is quite fascinating, because we have such a propaganda machine that gives this narrative that we are fighting for the global democracy and that a victory in Ukraine is possible. And yet, despite that, you see the latest AP poll says that 48%, only 48% of Americans say they want to continue sending weapons to Ukraine. I find that extraordinary. The other 52% say they either don't want to, or they don't know, or they don't care. And that, to me, is exactly what Francesco said, which is, why don't we have that reflected in the political scene of the country? And we don't have that at all. What we have is a bipartisan support now in Congress to push for fighter jets to be sent to Ukraine. Of course, this is just the latest of the endless stream of new weapons to be sent. And the only ones that we have questioning this within the elected officials on the national level are the extreme right. There is a very extreme right group that has just put forward a resolution calling for an end to all support for Ukraine, including economic aid to Ukraine. And that only has 11 Republicans on it. but it is also reflected in the position of Donald Trump, who keeps coming out with actually very, very good positions on this war. And his rival in the Republican Party, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who has presidential pretensions, also came out recently saying that he is questioning the blank check for Ukraine and says that Russia is not a threat to the NATO allies. The Democratic Party has been pathetic after 30 of the progressive Democrats signed a letter calling for negotiations and withdrew it within 24 hours. They've been so afraid to touch this issue of negotiations. It is remarkable. We go through the halls of Congress pretty regularly. We just had a lobby day 2 days ago, and we can't get the Democrats to come out even with public statements calling for negotiations. There was a demonstration on February 19th that was trying to bring together left and right. It was very fascinating. We haven't had those kind of demonstrations in the United States. Unfortunately, it was only about 1,000 people, but it was the first of its kind, extremely controversial, but it lit a fire under the left, who is now pushing for a big demonstration on March 18th. We're also calling for demonstrations on March 8th, International Women's Day. And I want to say that what I find, you ask of what can change the US. You know, I think the change in the US is coming from the outside. It's coming from the recognition in the global South that they have to create some different mechanisms. It's coming from the recognition that big countries that can have to get away from the dollar. And it's coming from the recognition that Rainer Braun said to us that Europe has to have its own security architecture. These kind of things are going to have an impact eventually in the United States. And in the meantime, as we try to build up, we get our strength from each other. When the International Peace Bureau called on religious leaders to call for a Christmas truce, we took that up in the United States and got 1,500 religious leaders calling for a Christmas truce. And we want to build having a lobby day by religious leaders in the halls of Congress. We see the Europeans having the support from the trade union movement, and it pushes us to push our trade union movements to get on board on this. We're excited about building globally, getting the environmental movement to recognize what a catastrophe this is for the environment on so many different levels. And I think we can do a lot by pressuring people in the environmental movement, as well as people who have been pushing for an end to nuclear weapons. We have to have their voices much more loud on this issue now of the war in Ukraine. So I'm excited to be with you all because that's where I get my strength. And I want to end by quoting something that Lula said when he visited with Biden. And Biden was pressuring Brazil to send weapons to Ukraine. And he said, no way. He said, we do not want to join this war. We want to end this war. And I think that is what we are all calling for today. And it's these kind of forums that give us the inspiration to push inside our own countries, and me specifically inside the belly of the beast. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Medea. And yes, I think that coordination internationally is going to be incredibly important for us as we go forward, not only showing solidarity between us, but organising more effectively together. Who would like to come in on any of the points that Medea has referred to, or Rainer?
Yeah, I have 2 points to Medea. First of all, Medea, we both have not mentioned that we are in an organizing team which is preparing the International Peace Conference for Negotiations and Ceasefire in Vienna in June. And I hope you all can put this on your calendar, that this important event hopefully brings together the different peace movements all around the world, and above all, also many people and leaders from the global South to enlarge the pressure for ceasefire and negotiations. Second, my question, Medea, it's interesting for me that maybe the new peace coalition in the US is a coalition between the Republicans and the peace movements. Is this the coalition which will stop the war? Or how do you see it? Because, you know, I'm deeply convinced that the Democrats in the biggest majority are really going for war day to day. So what is this? And I can imagine that this is tremendously controversial, but maybe you can explain a little bit. Are you discussing with these Republicans about common activities?
Do you want to just very quickly answer that, and then I'll turn to Lindsay and Francesco. Go ahead.
So far, no, Reiner. The many factions of the small peace movement we have are very determined not to work with Republicans and conservatives on that. I think it's a mistake. I think eventually we will have to make common cause because the Democrats are so bad, and this is being labeled as President Biden's war. And, you know, we have all the time elections coming up. And so I think it will eventually happen, but it is happening very slowly and painfully.
Okay, this is controversial, I know. Lindsay, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that you have to put some sort of parameters over who you work with. And I mean, it is a real problem in terms of the Democrats in the US. We've had this problem for many years with Tony Blair, who was a huge warmonger. But we try to sort of be quite careful not to tie up with openly right-wing people. Particularly, we've always tried to make the case about supporting refugees and being against racism and things like that, which is one way that you can, you know, it does begin to open these things up, because I think otherwise the truth is you're going to do it on a narrow basis, and it'll be a basis of just simply being against war, which obviously we all are. But you've then got to look at questions like, is this just because it's about isolationism and not wanting to spend money on aid to other countries and so on? Or is it on the basis of the kind of things that perhaps we might identify with more, about wanting a world which is more internationalist, but based on peace and based on a different set of international relations? And I was quite interested, Madeira, I'd be interested in your comments about how small the demonstration was, because it had very high profile speakers and so on, but it obviously didn't mobilize people on any kind of major basis. And I'd be interested to know why you think that is. And I think it might be because lots of people on the left and maybe some on the right do have major political differences with each other.
Could you quickly answer that, Medea, before I turn to Francesco?
Yes. Well, on the issue of the size of the rally, I think there has not been a lot of mobilizing since COVID of big numbers. And I think a lot of people were watching it online, but also because of the controversy. Certainly many people on the left didn't come out. And then in terms of this issue of who do you work with, we went into the offices yesterday of one of the most right-wing Republicans, and just to say, you know, we agree with you on this one issue. And the staff came out to cheer us and said, my father is a hippie leftist, and this is one of the only issues that we can agree on. I don't know how we can just, you know, narrowly isolate ourselves and say we'll only work with people who agree with us on immigrant rights, on this, on that, on trans issues. We will have a very small tent. I think we need a much bigger tent on this issue. And because it's such a political issue and because it's so identified with the Democrats, I don't think we have a choice except to broaden it and work with people we don't agree with on other issues.
I can see that this is going to be a much bigger and longer discussion, which we can't really get into now in any depth, but it does merit discussion. And for those of you on the left, it's just suddenly reminded me of the big debates that used to take place about the difference between a popular front and a united front and the basis on which these things happen and so on. But anyway, yeah, it's absolutely important to be talking about that going forward. Francesco, over to you.
Yeah, I won't enter into this discussion, even if it's more interesting. And of course, given the government we have in Italy, it's quite the same. But just to respond to a note made in the chat, are there any demonstration against Putin? Of course, if you demonstrate for peace and against war, you demonstrate against everyone that, you know, is warmonger, everyone that use weapons, everyone that wants more military expenditure. But we don't want to be tricked into the fact that we are the good ones and are always the bad ones. War is the bad thing. So you have to put into the non-violent process all of this. Otherwise, it would be only a matter of, you know, having a banner or another banner and be pro one thing or anti one thing. No, we want war to end. And of course, this is a process, is a creative process based on non-violence. So let's stop to talk about only Putin or not Putin or, you know, Biden or non-Biden. Let's talk about the processes that can really protect people.
Thanks, Francesco. Very, very important point there. And now I'm going to turn to Cora for your final words, and then I'll hand back to either Sean or Rainer to close the meeting. To Sean there. So, Corazon, please.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate. You know, going back to what Medea said, you know, it's always a big, big challenge to, you know, to really come up with a common cause. And oftentimes, you know, it's a very painful process. And what we do, for example, in the Philippines, is just to agree on a particular issue and not go very comprehensively. And even with that, it becomes really painful. But we've learned our lessons, you know, our experience of the rejection of the treaty in between the United States and the Philippines. That was a very strong learning experience for us that we carry that to this day. But we also know that that was not enough, because you see, the US have returned to the Philippines and have now, you know, expanded the bases here. So what I'm going to say is that the struggle really comes, does not end, you know, even for a particular issue, it comes and goes in different dimensions. And I think that it is really, really important to understand our history. For me, that is what I'm going to kind of as my parting word here. And also the very important work among us, that more younger generation would join us in this struggle.
Thanks very much, Cora. Absolutely. And a big thank you to all our panelists. We've just started off a whole new discussion there, which is very important. And I hope there will be many more of these discussions, either online or in person, so that we can really be as effective as possible as a peace movement, united going forward. Sean, over to you.
Yes, so thank you to all of our attendees and participants, as well as the amazing comments and remarks from all of our panelists in the roundtable, as well as the speakers from Russia and Ukraine, and our introductory words from Mishael. Really, this was a wonderful event to bring together peace-loving peoples. And of course, while we might not agree on everything, we agree on the central point that peace is needed and that we need to work towards a solution to the war in Ukraine in the best way possible. So we have had also many great remarks in the chat for this webinar, and I have saved the chat. So hopefully we will be able to share those remarks as well moving forward. Regarding the event that was mentioned by a couple of our speakers, we will soon be releasing a first announcement about the Vienna Peace Conference that will take place in June. So hopefully we'll be happy to share that information with those who are interested. For any questions or requests for further cooperation or actions, you can always write to IPB at our email, info@ipb-office.berlin. As well as to follow us on our social media pages and check our website for the latest information. I would also like to thank all of the sponsors of today's events. This was not possible just by IPB, but rather a cooperation between the International Peace Bureau with the Peace in Ukraine Coalition of the United States, which includes Code Pink and several other organizations. Also the Mouvement de la Paix in France, CND in the UK, and the Transform Europe network as well. So thank you very much to all of our partners for that. Just to say as a final remark, IPB and our partners, we are nonprofit organizations that put on events such as this on quite a tight budget. If anyone would like to support us so that we can increase activities such as this in the future, we will also share the donation link in the chat and would be much appreciated for any support that is given there. So thank you very much. I will close the session today on those words and wish you all the best, and hope we can continue working together for peace in Ukraine and peace beyond in the world, and for a just peace. Thank you.